I want to put a question before you. Don't raise your hand too quickly, you'll see why. But I want you to think about this, and here's my question. Is your family perfect? And by perfect, I mean, free from jealousy and resentment and strife. You've got no hidden secrets, no lies or skeletons. You are exactly as the world sees you. We got any families like that? Yeah, no, probably not. Because no family is perfect. As someone once said, families are like fudge. Mostly sweet, but with a few nuts. When we are honest with ourselves, and we rarely are in this matter, we will admit that most of our families do put the fun in dysfunctional. We've got our family secrets, our embarrassments, our jealousies. We've got our pettinesses, our resentments, and our insecurities. We should all be in therapy. And for this reason, there happens to be a broad body of study on families, family relationships. And the studies are by psychologists, therapists, anthropologists, and more. Everybody's trying to figure out how the family works together. And one of the most interesting offshoots of this area of study is the work of a man named Edwin Friedman. Friedman was a rabbi. He's now deceased. And he's the author of a book called Generation to Generation. It's a favorite of pastors and rabbis. Friedman takes the work of family systems theory and he applies it to synagogues and churches. So, yes, if you've ever felt that the stresses in your church were eerily familiar, that's because they largely mirror the stresses that we find in our families. And often we transfer the stresses of our families onto our church relationships. And it's no accident that when we speak of our church family, it really is. When a family is free from any unusual stress, they function as they normally would. That's a good day. But when a family comes under stress for whatever reason, then we've learned that members of the family adopt certain roles. They take on personalities or jobs. Friedman and others have identified these, and he's given names to these jobs and personalities. And among the several, they include the family hero, the scapegoat, and the caretaker. Those are three of many. So what are these like? Well, just to give you an idea, the family hero, for example, the family hero is the perfect one, the golden child, the one on whom all praise and attention can be showered. When a family is under stress, the family hero presents a facade that makes everything appear all right. A family can be falling apart, but if Jenny's the prom queen, then they can pretend that all is good and normal. Another of these personalities is the scapegoat. And the scapegoat is the family member on whom all the problems are blamed, whether it's their fault or not. The family will say something like, if not for Bobby's fill in the blank, drinking, stealing, lying, drugs, bad grades, whatever. If it weren't for that, we'd be fine. Everything would be perfect. He's the reason we're in this mess. That's the role of the scapegoat, to take on the blame of the system. And then there's the caretaker. We also call this one the mascot. And this is the member of the family system, and it's usually a child who takes responsibility for the family's emotional well-being. Usually the mascot or the caretaker becomes like the clown of the family to divert the family's attention away from their pain and anger. But for a child to take on this responsibility, it's a terrible price. Now, having said all that, our scripture reading for today continues our journey through the book of Genesis. And today we come to that story of the birth of Esau and Jacob, twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. And it's easy to forget that they're twins because they're so different, but they are twins. Now I want you to go back to thinking about family dysfunctions, and I want you to think of all the family dysfunctions you can. Make a list in your head, and then I want to just dump them out on the floor in front of us. And it doesn't matter how much anxiety, anger, fear, resentment, or insecurity we're dredging up. If we fill this room with dysfunction, it still wouldn't match what we find in the stories of Jacob and Esau and their families. It just goes on, and we're going to be talking about this for the next couple of weeks. As I said, Jacob and Esau are the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, as you will recall, is the only son of Abraham and Sarah. And many years earlier, God had reached out to Abraham and Sarah and called them to follow him to a land that he would show them. And in return, God promised the couple descendants as numerous as the stars. And the names Abraham and Sarah would become a blessing to all the families of the earth. So Abraham and Sarah comply, and they resettle in the land of Canaan. At the time of this call, as I've mentioned every week, Abraham and Sarah were well on in years and had no children, and the promise of their having descendants seemed rather far-fetched, to say the very least. Abraham does have a son, Ishmael, with his servant Hagar, but God informs Abraham that God's promise will play out through the descendants of Isaac, not Ishmael, because even in her advanced years, Sarah has given birth to a son. Now, God's plan seems to be put on hold when God instructs Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, his only son, which he almost does. But Isaac survives. And then later on, his father finds him a wife, Rebekah, among Abraham's kin, because Abraham is adamant that his son will not marry a Canaanite woman. Rebekah is brought back to Canaan to marry Isaac. Now, this couple, Isaac and Rebekah, really, they should have had a fairy tale life. They're like royalty. They seemingly had everything going for them. Isaac was practically a prince and would inherit his father's great wealth. Rebekah was a beautiful young bride from a good family, and yet they still were not immune to the problems of life. And for one thing, Isaac and Rebekah did not conceive children for the first 20 years of their marriage. And if the promise of God to Abraham was that he would be the father of a great many descendants through Isaac, if this was to be fulfilled, then Isaac needs to reproduce here. And it's been 20 years they've been married and no children, and so we relive the old tension of God's promise. And so Isaac prays to the Lord. And in his time, his prayers are eventually answered, and Rebekah becomes pregnant. And the pregnancy is clearly a difficult one because, as we read just a moment ago, we are told that the children struggled together within her. And in fact, this pregnancy was so distressing to Rebekah that at one point she called out to God asking, "Why do I have to live?" It was that bad. And God answered her cry, saying this: two nations are in your womb, and two peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. Well, I'm sure this made her feel better. And eventually Rebekah gives birth to twin boys. They're not identical. In fact, they couldn't be more different. The first twin to be born had a body, we are told, that was reddish and covered in hair. And they named him Esau, which means hairy one. Later on, he would take on the name Edom, which means red. The second of the twins was born with his hand still gripping onto the heel of his brother, which was continuing that struggle that was initiated within the mother's womb. This child they named Jacob. Now in Hebrew, the word Jacob sounds a lot like two other words. One is the word for heel, as well as the word for deceiver. And we'll see why this is in a moment. And later on, Jacob's name will change to Israel. So now, Isaac has two sons. And the question is, through which one will God's promise play out? The story then jumps from the account of their birth, and it tells us that the boys grew up and could not be more different from one another. Esau was an outdoorsman and a skilled hunter. Jacob, on the other hand, was quiet and lived inside. Esau was his father's son, and Jacob was his mother's favorite. And from his mother, he learned, among other things, to cook. Then there's the story we read of that day that Jacob had cooked up a stew. It must have smelled delicious because when Esau came in from hunting, he was famished. And he told his brother to give him some of that red stuff. Jacob tells Esau, "No, I want something in return." "What? What do you want?" And Jacob says, "I want you to sell me your birthright." Now, since Esau is the firstborn, if only by a few seconds, then he is due the greater portion of his father's estate, along with any titles that go with it. That is his birthright. And with that, being a son of Abraham, he would also get the blessing of God. But instead of refusing Jacob's negotiation, Esau says, "Brother, I'm dying here. I'm starving to death. What use is a birthright to me at this point in my life?" Well, he's not about to die. He's just hungry. So Jacob presses on. And I can imagine he takes the ladle and he kind of stirs the soup a bit to fan the smell towards his hungry brother. And Jacob says, "Swear to me first." And Isaac gives in. He swears. Esau gives in and he swears. And on the spot, right there, he sells his birthright to Jacob for some soup and bread. Not a good move. Now, on one level, the purpose of this story is to explain to a later audience of Israelites the cause of the strained relationship between Israel and the Edomites, a different people. The Edomites were an older nation of people that had been supplanted by the Israelites when the Israelites moved into Canaan. How could this happen? Well, the story attempts to explain it by telling us how the younger Jacob acquired the blessing of God and the birthright and got the upper hand of his brother Esau, aka Edom, or red. And the Edomites were an older nomadic people who preferred hunting, while the newer Israelite people tended to be farmers and lived in settled communities. You can see how this story explains the situation between the two peoples. But there's more to it than that, especially for us today who know little to nothing about these Edomites. I mean, we could care less about the Edomites. So digging a little deeper, peeling back some of the layers, we can see that what this story does tell us is a great deal about Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. And this God is not like other gods. Yahweh is not like the gods of the Canaanites or the Edomites or the Moabites or any of the other people of the region. This God is something new, something different. And what we see here is that with the old order, the tables have been turned. In the regular scheme of things, the oldest son receives the blessing. But here, the youngest fights and claws his way past his brother, who is both ruled and ruined by his appetites. In the old order, might means right, but here, power loses out to something else. In the old order, the small gods of the people provide instant gratification. Do you want a bountiful crop? Then appease your small god with a sacrifice and make it so. But here we find a God who schemes across the generations. God's great plan is for the salvation of all people. It's not about a crop here or a crop there. It's about all people. And it's far grander than anyone can imagine. With this God, we live in the constant tension of a promise made and yet a promise that is to be fulfilled. But that is our God, a God who loves us beyond reason, a God who will gladly disrupt the old order, a God who makes all things new, a God who sees beyond our ambitions, our deceits, our enmity, and our pride. This is the God who stands by his promise, even when we don't. A God who will sacrifice everything for our sake. This is the God of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, of Jacob, who will become Israel. This is the God who sent his own son to die so that we might be saved. This is our God, and for this we must be thankful. Amen.